This is Chatter. I'm Eugenia Lochtri, Lawfare's Fellow in Technology Policy and Law. This week, how the FBI ran its own tech startup to wiretap criminals, with Joseph Cox.
Because the FBI, of course, wanted to expand in the same sort of way that real encrypted phone companies do, they had to cede some power. They did that by giving one of these black boxes to a trusted seller. What changed for those online drug markets is that it wasn't just sort of ordinary people buying a party drug on the internet anymore. It developed into wholesale distributors of cocaine would actually source their drugs from Silk Road and from other drug markets. It gets to the point where at least one criminal in Europe learns about what is happening, drives from Sweden throughout Europe, and those officials inside Europol have to basically shout at one another, like, he's in this country now, he's in this country, please execute the search warrant against him. And they're basically chasing him to hunt him down.
Joseph, welcome to Chatter. I'm actually so excited to be talking to you about your new book, Dark Wire. I have to admit, I could not put it down after I started. I think I read it in like 2 days. And I've been looking forward to talking to you about it for so long. So welcome.
Thank you so much. And I'm glad that it was a gripping read. As a notoriously slow reader, I'm glad that people are getting through it very, very quickly. And a few people have said that, 1 or 2 sittings. So thank you.
Yeah, no, it's just, it reads so easily. It feels like I'm watching a show.
I did that deliberately. Yes, very, very deliberately. It's meant to be a movie, basically. And it's just this propulsive narrative about stuff that's also pretty important, I think.
Yeah, no, it is. But before we get to the book, which again, I'm so excited to talk to you about, I actually wanted to ask you about your day job, right? You co-founded not that long ago 404 Media with 3 other colleagues, right? So you describe it as a sustainable, responsible, reader-supported media business that is kind of centered on society-shifting technology journalism. So what does it all mean? Can you speak a little bit more about your mission and how 404 Media actually came to be?
Yeah, sure. So all of us, and that's me, Samantha Cole, Emmanuel Mayberg, and Jason Kebler, we all used to be at Motherboard, which was the technology section of Vice. Some listeners may be familiar with Vice's work, going in and embedding with ISIS and then doing all sorts of other really, really crazy, powerful journalism. The business side of it was not so good for a bunch of decisions beyond our control, and the company went bankrupt, and a ton of people got laid off, journalists who literally went into war zones and into the field. But while they were laying off those people, the executives were making $900,000 a year with 6-figure bonuses while they were laying off these people, and that made me pretty angry, very, very mad. And it just didn't seem sustainable anymore that we were doing all this great work, but the business just wasn't working. So we decided to leave and make our own thing. There's so much more space for journalist-founded and worker-owned media outlets now. The technology is available that we decided to do that to make, as you say, this sustainable vehicle for our journalism that would also grow responsibly. And that's a very fancy, almost grandiose way of putting it. It's like, people pay us, and then we will make journalism, and hopefully they get value for it. And we've been successful. Our 1-year anniversary is going to be in August/September, around that time. And we're doing it, and we're publishing stories every single day. Just one yesterday was about how the ID verification system for Uber, X, /Twitter, and TikTok was hacked and had a bunch of driver license data exposed. That is the sorts of stories we want to do. Stories that we need time to investigate and room to investigate. And now we can do that because we own the business as well.
How did you get started with tech journalism? What was it about those kind of stories that first interest you?
So I grew up with computers. I grew up learning the command line in MS-DOS, figuring out how the graphics worked and figuring out how to open games that maybe I was a little bit too young to be playing at that time. And then fast forward several years, I'm studying philosophy at university. That wasn't a job, it turned out. Maybe it could have been, but not for me. It's just going to be way, way too depressing. So then I pivot into epistemology and then journalism as well. And it's felt like sort of a practical way to go about it. As for how then tech got back into that, I was doing a lot of reporting on cybercrime and on the dark web marketplaces like Silk Road, where you could log on and buy heroin with Bitcoin. That was really, really big, obviously, in 2013 and slightly before. And I think probably unsurprisingly, a real catalyst was the Edward Snowden revelations. My view on those revelations has, of course, morphed and changed over time. But at the moment, in 2013, I mean, I was an intern at Vice, and it was hugely significant. No matter what you think about those revelations, it was a hugely significant news story and a moment in time. And from there, I started to cover privacy, surveillance, and then eventually really carved out a niche in sort of the sale of data, the recontextualization of data, like a lot of stuff about how our smartphones are selling location data, similar to what Byron Tower was doing at the Wall Street Journal. And I did my own sort of vein of reporting on there. But there's always been that constant through line through technology. And I just can't imagine it being any other way. I just love computers and I love hacking. And I am really interested in surveillance and police powers and investigative powers and all of that. It's all incredibly fascinating to me.
I wonder if there's a common origin story here. I feel like the first few games that I played were bootleg versions that I had to crack into my computer. And I wonder if that's how we all kind of got started into this.
Yeah, we have to find workarounds. Like the one specifically for me was like, I think the graphics card on my machine stopped working, and that's why I couldn't use the graphical interface or something like that. So that's why I had to figure out the terminal/command line to like open Doom so I could just play that. It doesn't sound quite right, but it was something along those lines. I was like, oh, you can make this computer do things very, very specific that you want it to do. And that just opened up the whole world to me.
Yeah. I get that. Now, I really like your bio on your page. You know, it says that your investigations have triggered hundreds of millions of dollars worth of fines and has even shut down tech companies. I'm curious, what is the impact that you're the most proud of?
It probably is those fines that I mentioned. Whenever somebody asks me to give a bio for a conference or something, I'm just like, well, I just have to shove that in because it sounds the best. And of course it does. But I mean, also it was just like the most fulfilling reporting wise, and the specific story or series of stories that one is talking about is that the New York Times did a piece about a company that had access to cell phone location data of basically all the major carriers, if I'm remembering correctly, and corrupt cops were using it to spy on, judges and I think love interests as well. 6 months later, I get an email from a bounty hunter who says, oh yeah, we're doing this as well. I can prove it to you. It costs a few $100s. And I'm like, what are you talking about? There is no way this is true. Like, I didn't believe him at all. And then we took the step of verifying that information by paying this person $300. And now, to be clear, we don't pay for information. That's unethical. But here, the context of the story was specifically anybody can go out and buy this capability. So we went and did it to verify it. And it was true. And we obviously tell the telcos about it. There's a lot of reaction from lawmakers and the telcos themselves. They actually stopped selling the data entirely. And then these fines of hundreds of millions of dollars come in. And they were just confirmed, I think last month, maybe a couple of months ago. I'm sure it'll get appealed. But that was the one I was most proud of. And I should just really clarify that my main metric is impact, absolutely. But that doesn't make me an activist in any sort of way, in my opinion. I include everything on the spectrum of impact, from I made lawmakers say something in a hearing so we can all get informed about it, right up to shutting down a tech company. And I'm never pushing for one particular type of impact. I just think impact in general is a good metric, and you have to be intellectually honest about that. Like, when I've shut down tech companies, that has meant that dozens of people have also lost their jobs, and like, that's on me, and you have to completely own it. You can't just be like, oh, I did the good thing and then completely ignore the bad thing. It's complicated when you're doing investigative journalism.
Well, it seems like it's all been building up to this incredible book that you wrote. So for any listener that might not have read the book yet, and I do encourage anyone listening that you need to go and read this book, could you briefly summarize the plot so that we're all on the same page as we discuss it?
Yeah, sure. So in 2018, organized criminals, drug traffickers, hitmen, really top-tier money launderers, they start using this encrypted messaging app or phone called Anom. This kind of works like Signal or WhatsApp or Telegram or any of the other dizzying amount of encrypted apps we have around today, but it was specifically marketed to criminals. It was very, very expensive to get on. You'd have to pay hundreds, if not thousands of dollars for a 6-month subscription. But it starts in Australia. It then moves to Europe because some very big drug traffickers start using it. And then it spreads all over the world. They're planning all sorts of crimes on there. Multi-ton shipments of cocaine, assassinations, amphetamine labs in the European countryside, everything you can possibly imagine. All the while that is happening, Anom has a secret. And that is that Anom is actually being run by the FBI. For years, they are intercepting every single message sent across this platform and getting a ton more information as well. That is, of course, the very high level plot. There's a lot more to it. It's a 300-page book, but it is the largest law enforcement sting operation ever because something like 10,000 police officers acted on the final day when they did shut it down. And I also think it's the most significant sort of encryption law enforcement sting ever. For years, experts, policymakers, activists, journalists, whoever, have had to sort of speculate what it would look like if the FBI did get a backdoor into a tech product. Well, this is it. It literally happened, and this is the story of what happens when the FBI has that incredible capability.
So what drove you to actually write a book about it? Because you've been doing a lot of the reporting about the story as it unfolded, right? You've been looking into this issue of the encrypted phone companies for some time. Did you feel like there was something kind of left to uncover? Was a book just a different medium through which you could tell the story? What was it about the story that drove you to write the book?
Yeah, you're right. I've been covering the encrypted phone industry since around 2016 when they first heard about these phones. And that included covering how the FBI shut down another encrypted phone company called Phantom Secure, how the Europeans hacked into 2 others called Sky and EncroChat, and they all become part of the wider story later. I'd never really wanted to write a book. First, it sounded like a lot of work. I'm already busy, man. I don't know if I can handle doing a book as well, trying to do all this other stuff. But, I got over that. And the second was that at the time, before the FBI revealed it was running Anom, it just didn't seem like a clear arc. It was like, okay, so criminals use these companies, these encrypted phones, and then the FBI shut down one of the companies. Okay, who cares? And it's when the FBI revealed on June 7th, 2021, that it had been running Anom that, well, first of all, I did not see that coming. I was blown away, but that they would actually do that. But it made total sense when I reflected on it. And that, basically the same day, was the moment I realized, this is the book. This is the final act of, they went from these encrypted phones being a real issue for law enforcement in the US and in Australia and in Europe, to shutting down the companies, to the FBI then running its own. It made complete sense when I stood back and looked at it that way. The funny thing is, when I went and then started to report and figure out what happened, because although the FBI announced it ran Anom, it was just a press conference, it wasn't really enough to go on. I went and spoke to some of my phone selling sources, the people who sell them to organized criminals. It turns out they had been selling Anom phones as well. They just didn't want to tell me because they thought they had a really good thing going. They were making a lot of money. They had a great side hustle. And that blew up in their faces, obviously, when they realized they were actually being hunted by the FBI. But
the FBI was not really looking to set up this company at the beginning, right? I mean, if I recall, they just wanted a backdoor or some access, especially when they're talking to Phantom Secure. And then this when I read it, I was blown away. This is kind of an incredible opportunity that comes to them, with this criminal who's like, hey, I know that you're looking into these companies. What if I just sold you the one that I'm going to be setting up? So can you talk a little bit more about the circumstances that lead to this, again, just, I was blown away, this incredible development and how they were able to seize that opportunity.
Yeah. So in 2018, the FBI shuts down Phantom Secure. It does this in part by luring the CEO, a guy called Vincent Ramos, to Las Vegas. And initially what they do is they, tell him, we know you're running this company. It's selling phones to very, very bad people. And we will put you behind bars. We're going to use RICO against you, which is very, very novel and interesting here because the Canadians who are dealing with these phones, they don't have RICO. And selling a phone there is not illegal. Even selling a phone potentially to criminals is not illegal there. Same with Australia, where they could disrupt individual criminal gangs, but they could not stop the flow of encrypted phones. And that's why the Americans got involved, because they had RICO and they could frame Phantom Secure, or these encrypted phone companies more generally, as a criminal enterprise in its own right. And I mean, that's an incredible legal capability for the FBI that these other countries didn't have. So they're in this Las Vegas hotel room and they're trying to flip Vincent Ramos. But rather than just arresting them, what they really want is a backdoor into Phantom Secure. Phantom had something between 7,000 and 10,000 devices online, depending on what point in time or depending on what estimate you believe. And it was being used by like the Sinaloa drug cartel. It was being used by bikie gangs in Australia who were assassinating people in the street. And imagine the power that the FBI or the Australian authorities could have if they could read those messages. You'd be able to read the communications of the Sinaloa cartel or any other number of criminal organizations. So that's what the FBI wants. That doesn't come to fruition. Vincent Ramos runs off in the dead of night from this hotel room where him and a bunch of the agents are sleeping, and he escapes and he tries to get to the Canadian border. He doesn't get over. He gets recaptured. So then they just shut down Phantom Secure.
Sorry to interrupt you here,
Yes.
but I think it's incredible that it's because he stops to get breakfast that they get him. He's like,
Yes.
so close to the border. And he's like, no, actually, I need a little coffee. I need some pancakes. And that's how they get him. That's insane.
Yeah, he's on his way to the Canadian border, and for some reason, he either slightly goes back or he stops in this, basically a border town. Like, it's really not far from the Canadian border, and he's in a diner in this shares a parking lot with a Trader Joe's, and he's just having his breakfast. At the time, a local media outlet reported that he was eating chicken and waffles, and I spoke to a family member of Ramos who vehemently denied that it was chicken and waffles. Like, no, it was absolutely okay. Very weird detail to get fixated on, but I'll take your word for it.
What
absolutely.
was it then? If it was
well,
not...
I don't know. I don't know what it was, but it was not. It was not chicken and waffles.
Okay, so now we know.
Yes, exactly. So he is apprehended there, and he's eventually sentenced, and that comes much later. But crucially, what this showed was that, hey, the gold rush of selling encrypted phones to organized criminals is over, or at least the start. This is the start of the end of this industry that's been going for years, if not well over a decade by this point. So that spooks a lot of the other companies. Sky, which is basically the juggernaut of the industry, rapidly starts trying to kick criminals off its platform, or at least give itself plausible deniability. And then, most importantly for the FBI, there is this character called AFGO, AFGOO. That's a pseudonym that they use. And they had sold Phantom Secure and Sky devices. But on the side, they had been developing what they called the next generation of encrypted phones, called Anom. And of course, this is what AFGO then offers to the FBI. Hey, I'm going to give you this. In exchange, you give me potentially a lighter sentence for maybe any charges I may face in the future or I may not. Again, the point is now that, damn, if they're arresting and charging Ramos, what's going to happen to all of the other people selling these phones? And that's the context in which he makes this deal. and he gets something like $120,000 and $60,000 in travel expenses. So, let's say $200K, just roughly. The FBI paid $200K for an incredible opportunity. And as you said, actually pretty lucky. They didn't really go out and find this person. The person came to them and handed them a backdoor into organized crime, or rather the potential for a backdoor into organized crime, because Anom was a nobody or a nothing at that point. It was a startup, really. So the FBI needed the people to buy the phones, and that's going to be the first hurdle.
And that leads me perfectly into my next question, which is, how do you set up a company when the FBI buys it? Like, what does that look like? What is the structure? How involved did the FBI end up being kind of in the day-to-day?
The funny thing is, it looks exactly like a tech company. And that's all that, on one hand, that's hilarious. Just the idea that the FBI is basically running a Facebook for criminals. And that is true. But it also makes complete sense because it's an undercover operation, for lack of a better way of putting it. Like, they need criminals to think this is just another criminal encrypted phone company. So the way that looks is that you have Afgu at the top, the creator / CEO, I guess. Below him on one side, you'll have people who are developing the app, actual coders. And I've spoken to some of those people. They had no idea they were, in fact, working for the FBI. Parallel to them, you will have the people selling the phones. And crucially, it is not the FBI going out with agents selling the phones, because they wanted to avoid all potential claims of entrapment. And, I'm not a legal expert, but you can see how that would at least come up if the FBI was going out, handing somebody a phone, saying, hey, you should do some crimes on here, then they do it. That could be a very bad thing.
And that's the same reason why they don't really go after very specific targets. They're not saying, oh, you should be selling to this group or this person, right?
Yes, and I don't think this is actually in the book because I literally couldn't fit it in, but there were discussions about that and they were shot down, essentially. Like, no, you cannot send this phone to this specific person. It has to be spread organically. So that was very hands-off from the FBI. Then below there, you have the individual customers who, of course, aren't really part of the company, but they're using it. At the top of the pyramid, above Afgu, is the FBI running the whole thing, this sort of constant shadowy presence, but they're not entirely hands-off for a couple of pretty important reasons. The first is that Anom, in order to become popular in the criminal underground, it has to introduce good features. Like, this isn't the time of Phantom Secure anymore. There was just sending PGP emails. It was clunky on a BlackBerry QWERTY keyboard. No offense to people who love BlackBerries, but this is 2018 now. People aren't going to use that. We're after, this is long after the Obama BlackBerry stuff, all that, and long after BlackBerry was a cool brand. We're on Android phones now, and criminals want to send photos. They want to send voice memos. They want to send emojis and videos potentially as well. So the FBI, in its managerial position, says, yes, introduce all of these features, but crucially, you're going to put in extra ones which actually benefit us. So when there's an image redaction feature that the criminals could use, sure, they can blur out somebody's face, but we're going to get a copy of the original. Yes, there is a voice masking feature that will distort the speaker's voice, so if it gets intercepted, theoretically, you can't identify them. That's fine, but you're going to code in a way for us to be able to reverse that. And although the Anom users think that there's no GPS functionality in the phone, what you're actually going to do is turn on the GPS and it's there constantly. So the FBI is intervening on the feature side, sort of, the product development side, if you were started on a project. They're a project manager, basically, in Silicon Valley. So you have that. And then on the second side is they do actually move and interfere and influence the flow of hardware and the supply of phones. So there's a very key moment where the FBI shuts down Sky, again, one of these other companies, and a ton of users migrate over to Anom. Stock becomes difficult to maintain because there's so many users. So what the FBI does is that they buy thousands of Google Pixel phones, they put them into duffel bags, and they fly them on a Gulfstream jet from DC into Europe. And then I spoke to the agent who was on the airfield and picked them up. So those phones were then taken and then I think given to a dead drop, and then some Anom sellers pick them up. So these Anom sellers have no idea that the FBI was the one who just gave them the phones. And I was actually surprised by that, because in the press release and the press conference when the FBI announced it had ran Anom, it simultaneously said it ran it, but it was also, very hands off. They kind of did it. That didn't really turn out to be the case. They were taking direct action for sure.
Yeah, I have to say that passage struck out to me too, right? Because when I read that, I was like, okay, that's something different. That's something different from what we've been seeing. That is, I mean, I get it. They're seizing the opportunity. They have all of these new users that want to get on their platform. But it was a bit of a turning point, I felt, and something very different from the way that they had been characterizing the operation. Something that I liked was, you described it as, it's basically a tech company that's kind of funny. But it's also a multi-level marketing scheme from the seller's point of view, right? So what are the incentives there? How did that work, the reselling of the phones?
Yeah, I mean, one of the FBI agents I heard from basically described it as a pyramid scheme, which is true. And it's also how these other encrypted phone companies like Phantom Secure actually worked. So to keep the pyramid analogy sort of going, you have all of these people at the bottom, and they are just individual resellers. And then, they're the ones actually giving the phones to the clients. Above them, you'll have like regional distributors. Maybe they have rights over Australia or, a certain city in Australia or Europe or whatever. And then above them, you have AFCU. Then above them, you have the FBI. And like a multi-level marketing scheme, the money goes up the pyramid every single time. So maybe, the phones are sold for $500 or $1,000. And the price varied wildly because these resellers would not only try to screw over other encrypted phone companies, they would try to screw over each other. Like individual Anom sellers were getting into battles about, hey, no, this is my territory, you're not going to take it, to the point where that actually starts to get a bit violent and there's like real clashes inside the company. But the money trickles up and it goes up to the FBI. And the one question the FBI basically would not answer for me is how much money they made or how much the entire thing cost. But what they did say is that the money went to the top of the pyramid and then went back into, at least a lot of it, back into the operation. Because this is beyond the initial around 200K given to AFCU. You have to run infrastructure, which is very expensive when you have more than 10,000 phones by the end. Again, sourcing that hardware, like the Pixels, they flew over to Europe. The data, like these unlimited eSIMs, would be very expensive because that is what criminals are looking for. They're not just looking for the encrypted messaging side. They're looking for the incredible uptime of these encrypted phone companies. If you are trying to smuggle 5 tons of cocaine or whatever, and your service goes down and you can't talk to the person in Ecuador, who maybe then can't talk to the person in Antwerp, that is a massive pain, and you are potentially going to lose money. So as Andrew Young, one of the main prosecutors on it, he told me, like, they don't just have to run a good investigation, they have to run a good company. And that encompasses all of that, just like an ordinary tech firm. This
fight for, let's call it territory between the sellers, ends up taking some of the control of the company from, AFCU and therefore the FBI. What did that look like?
Yeah. So at the start with Anom, the phones are being produced or flashed, which is where you just install software onto a phone. That's all being done by a single company in Hong Kong. They don't know they're working for the FBI in effect. They're just this seller who takes the phones, they plug it into a small black box. It's basically a mini computer with no screen, really. You plug it into there and it installs the Anom software onto the phone. And that was good for the FBI because it was something of a bottleneck. Maybe if things got out of control, they could give fewer phones to there, or they could try to shut that down. But because the FBI, of course, wanted to expand both effectively and expand in the same sort of way that quote unquote real encrypted phone companies do, they had to cede some power. And what they did that by AFGU giving one of these black boxes to a trusted seller. And that starts in Europe, and then he's flashing his own phones so he can sell his phones quicker and grow the company more efficiently. What happens is that two people, Hakan Ayik, who is the most wanted man in Australia, he is a multi-billion-dollar drug trafficker. He is the top of the top. And his lieutenant, Maximilian Rifkin, who goes by the nickname Microsoft, no relation to the tech company. He has a friend in prison called Linux. They have a weird computer thing. I don't know why. Couldn't find that out. But I didn't even use the name Rifkin in the copy because I was just like, Microsoft is such a good nickname. I'm going to use that. Anyway, they realize, those black boxes are a means of power. If we can get hold of those, we can control Anom more ourselves. So they get some of the boxes, they physically seize some of them from this other seller in Europe, and there's basically a turf war inside Anom. Now, that's all very interesting, that's all very dramatic, that's all very entertaining, and maybe even a little bit funny if you're watching it, but it means that the FBI started to lose control of the distribution of Anom. There's no longer this bottleneck in Hong Kong. Hakan and Microsoft are flashing phones as they please. They are the ones in the driver's seat when it comes to the distribution of Anom now. And that could have serious consequences. What if there are too many phones out there in the wild, and then the FBI misses a crucial message where maybe somebody dies or is hurt? And that actually happened in at least one case I found. Like a young man was murdered in Sweden because his assassination was entirely planned on Anom. And the FBI didn't get those messages to the Swedish authorities in time.
So that actually brings me to a question. You know, throughout the book, you highlight these tough choices, right, that law enforcement has to make. The striking of the balance where you're like, okay, if I act on this information, am I going to blow the entire thing up, right? So, you know, it's tough. One, like, feels in a way for them because you do need to have some impact. You do need to be able to act on it, but you don't want to tip your hand because you're getting, especially as Anom becomes more and more popular, it gets in the hands of actually, you know, the top people. You don't want to stop that, but you also need to stop crimes from happening. So what was the threshold? You know, we have risk of life, you know, but also major drug operations. So were there differences across different law enforcement agencies on how they carried this out? Was it a common approach? How was this challenge actually tackled? Did they strike a good balance?
Yeah, it's a constant tension throughout the entire story of Anom, that they're collecting all of this amazing information, but if they act on it too quickly or too loudly, it will become obvious to the Anom users that something is up with the phones, maybe they're compromised, and they'll stop using the platform, and the FBI will burn its capability, essentially, for what is, you know, I think this is fair to say, probably a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I'm sure they're trying other stuff, but how the dominoes fell in place here, that might not happen again. So they don't want to blow it. And there's even examples where a Swedish official I spoke to, she's directing somebody to go perform a raid on a drug warehouse or something like that. Their counterpart calls up and asks, hey, like, is your source going to be burned by this if we do it? She says, oh, you know, let me get back to you. I'll make some phone calls. She hangs up the phone and she just twiddles her thumbs for a few minutes because she does not want to reveal the data is actually coming from Anom, even to some of her own colleagues. She felt bad about that, obviously, but she did it for the good of preserving the entire Anom operation. And when it came to threshold, it really was case by case, and it was different for various agencies. So there is a case where a lot of cocaine is being smuggled out of Ecuador in tuna cans. It's a multi-ton shipment, if I remember correctly, or I think a 1.5. And they could have let that go, but I think the local authorities were so skittish that they wanted to jump on it right then. And the FBI would have these meetings in Europe or elsewhere and these calls, and they would say or encourage them, hey, maybe that one's not good to go, sort of thing. Maybe don't do that. But they ultimately couldn't control it. And some agencies did go ahead basically without the FBI's, maybe blessing is too strong a word, but against the FBI's recommendations. That happened constantly, but also a ton of drug shipments were allowed to walk. And like that is a very, very controversial policy, even when you're talking about, I don't know, allowing drug sales on a corner in Baltimore or something, you know, to throw back to the wire, right? Imagine that. But now we're talking tons of cocaine on an international global scale. And that's sort of the impossible decisions that these agents had to make every single day. And I just don't think there's a textbook for that because we haven't seen that sort of operation before. You mentioned threat to life. That is sort of the one case where we're like, well, we have to absolutely act there. We learn that somebody's going to be killed or tortured or hurt. We have to act. And if it gets burned, it gets burned. But it didn't, at least right until the end when people did start to get suspicious. I am genuinely shocked and think it's a miracle that it did not leak.
Yeah, especially in these cases where, you know, law enforcement agencies go ahead even when it's not been like properly staged in a way to convince the criminals that, hey, this is not coming from, you know, Anom, but some other source. You know, did people start getting suspicious, or were there always convenient scapegoats?
Yeah, in Sweden specifically, before they got the Anom data, they had been using data from another encrypted phone company they mentioned called EncroChat. So they've been digging through that, they made arrests, they acted on intelligence, etc. When the Anom data came in, it was very good for the people in the intelligence unit that I spoke to, because they could just blame EncroChat. Oh, yeah, we're really busy because we're still going through that data, blah, blah, blah. And they could keep under wraps that the FBI had this entire new avenue of surveillance. Criminals did start to get suspicious of the phones at the end, especially, rather ironically, in the threat to life, right? Or rather at the start. So the way an FBI agent described it was that they get a threat to life, the FBI or its authorities, foreign authorities, they act on it, they stop the murder, they stop the torture, whatever. And then the bikers will talk to each other and they'll go, well, how the hell did they know that? And at first, rather than suspecting the phones, they suspect each other. And then they try to kill that guy who they think is a rat. And it's just this endless cycle of violence, which even though the FBI is intervening to stop, in a way it's also facilitating, and it's very, very complicated, ethically and logistically. Then I think around the April 2021 mark, or certainly in May, users of the phones start saying, look, there's something wrong with these phones. They're cursed. We just had another shipment of speed intercepted. I just gave a phone to one of my criminal cohorts in another city and he was raided immediately. The walls start closing in on these people and they're lashing out and they're realizing, maybe not fully, but they feel something is wrong. So
we have these kind of two parallel tracks, right? You have both the investigation and the company itself, right? And they both, in a way, follow the same path because they both start as kind of scrappy underdogs where no one really believes it. You know, Anom is, no one has heard of this company before, but also the people pushing to do this stint operation, they're just like, everyone's like, no, this is not going to work. We shouldn't do it. You know, it's this office out in San Diego, whatever. But then it just really starts growing and both of them end up being this like massive global operation, right? Like the FBI actually brings in partners from different countries. They just need to expand because the amount of messages that they're getting, the amount of information that they're getting is so much that they cannot process it all by themselves. So we talked a little bit about how this worked on the kind of the criminal side, how the phone became so popular and why it did become so popular. What were, on the other track, what were the challenges? Because bringing in partners also, you know, brings in a different set of, leaks could happen. You don't really know how much you can trust, but you also need to expand this reach because you have all of this information. And the whole point is to prevent people from dying, getting tortured, and, drug shipments getting through. So what did that look like?
Yeah, so the FBI started with a very trusted partner, and that's the Australian Federal Police, the AFP. And they were trusted because they were involved in the investigation into Phantom Secure. There were personal relationships built there. I mean, both with the AFP and also Queensland Police and I think New South Wales as well. So there's a very strong connection between the San Diego FBI specifically and a lot of these Australian officials who are sort of trying to counter encrypted phones. So that's a no-brainer at start, and they trust each other, and that's fine. And the AFP is very much looped into the back door from the start, and they know AFGU as well, and there's a relationship there. I describe a scene where there's officials from the San Diego FBI in a certain country that I won't disclose, and AFGU is talking to some of the geekier employees of the AFP, and they're having a great time talking about the tech details. So that's all well and good. As you say, the FBI then goes and does its own thing, but when it starts to get so many messages, and crucially messages that are non-English, because the phone is getting very popular in Europe, there's Swedish, there's Dutch, there's German, they do start to reach out to other partners, and they give access to the Swedish authorities. They give access to this surveillance backend called Holla iBot, and you log in and you can read whatever messages have been designated to you. They also give that to the Dutch through their legal attaché there, and then they also give it to the Germans as well. And that's all well and good, but it's a little ad hoc, it's a little arbitrary, just, we'll give it to these guys. And the idea for a formal operational task force is what they call it, a Europol, emerges. And the idea would be, well, let's bring in more than a dozen countries to formally work on this operation. And we can look at each other across the table and we can instantaneously share intelligence. Now, that didn't come out of nowhere. The FBI legal attaché I spoke to, who was in the Netherlands in The Hague, was actually very... so some construction work has just started outside my window, so sorry about that. Well, hopefully you can still hear my answers. But they bring together this task force, and it actually works out very, very effectively. And as well as all of those countries I mentioned, a ton more come in. There's Austria, Canada actually gets involved as well. And they're able to much more effectively use this intelligence. Whereas before it was just the FBI sending it ad hoc. Now they can act much, much more efficiently.
And speaking of the challenges of bureaucracy, what is interesting is that even though this is an FBI operation, it never actually looks at the messages in the US. They're not able to use this intelligence to do anything domestically. Why was that?
Yeah, it's essentially a legal issue, right? So if they were to surveil messages inside the US, they're going to need some sort of court order, right? And maybe that'd be a wiretap, or maybe be a search under the Fourth Amendment. It would most likely be a wiretap, right? Because you're intercepting. And that would create a lot of paperwork. It would create a lot of administrative work, which, to be clear, is a very, very good thing. It should not be easy to get a wiretap ordinarily, and it should not be easy to do it on this scale. So what they did instead was that the FBI found a third country that would take all of the messages from the Anom devices. The FBI will never publicly acknowledge this, and the DOJ won't either, but I found it was Lithuania, and I included that in the book. I think it's important that we know the legal structure of the biggest law enforcement sting operation ever. So what Lithuania did was it collected all of these messages, it then stored them temporarily, and it then transferred them to the FBI under a mutual legal assistance treaty, an MLAT. And that gave the FBI the benefit of accepting all of these messages basically with no strings attached. There's no it has to be limited to this specific investigation or anything like that. It's just a big old data dump of gigabytes, eventually terabytes of data that they can dig through. But again, those messages do not include phones that have landed in the US because of the legal and administrative hurdles there. The FBI actually coded it in so any phone that landed in the US simply would not be included in the data dump given by Lithuania. Like, it is technologically programmed so they cannot perform that sort of surveillance. That's not to say they didn't try. They developed boilerplate language where the prosecutors from San Diego would work with ones from LA. They prepared all that. And when at least one phone, well, I mean, actually many Anom phones landed in the US, but then they made an application to surveil the first set or the first one. They send that up the chain, and the wiretap order is just never approved. Clearly, other people in the DOJ do not want this operation to go ahead in the US. And that actually led to such frustration for Andrew Young, the main prosecutor, that he quit the DOJ. There was nothing more left for him to do. He had been the legal architect of this operation. And now, well, you're not going to let me do the US side? Well, I'm out, you know? And he left in part for that. Also, more money for his family, which I'm not going to blame him for at all.
No one will.
But exactly. But yeah, it never took off in the US, but they tried really, really hard. The FBI really wanted to do that.
No, there is, you know, in all of this legal architecture, kind of a presumption that if you're using an Anom phone, you are a criminal, and therefore we can just look at your messages, right? But that was not always the case. You know, you tell the story of lawyers whose, you know, confidential discussions with their clients got swept up in all of this because their clients only use this type of phones, or people who were texting their girlfriends, or there were personal conversations that would not be pertinent to an investigation. So how did they work around that? Yeah.
And you're right about the FBI's argument, because in their eyes, this is a tech product marketed just to criminals. And they even took some steps, like to get into the website for Anom, you'd have to type in a passcode that was given to you by a current reseller. So the hope was that, you know, you couldn't just stumble across this and just order one online or whatever. You had to know somebody to get in. That's not foolproof necessarily, because these resellers or the clients themselves, as you say, could then give phones to other people. So there are girlfriends in there. Some people do use the phones for very personal conversations, you know, sending photos of their genitalia across the platform as well. Stuff that is not pertinent to an investigation is how I would probably put it. And lawyers as well are included in there. So when it came to the lawyers, what the FBI said it would do was that it would just try not to monitor those messages, you know, unless obviously there's going to be a crime committed. And the same for civilians as well. They would just not check in on those messages as much as they could. That being said, stuff does get very confusing and tricky. In one particular case where this FBI special agent, Marshall Muse, he's very new, not just on the case, but he's very new to the organized crime squad that he's a member of. And he's digging through these messages, and this guy has an Anom phone, and he's given other phones to his girlfriends. But Muse thinks, I'm going to keep reading. Like, this guy, he's going to get up to something, even though he's just chatting to his various mistresses. Later on, it turns out one of the mistresses asks him to commit a crime, asks him to, I fell out with this person at a hair salon, I need you to go do something about it. And he orchestrates a firebombing, which is successfully carried out, even though the FBI warns the relevant authorities. And the reason I bring that up is, yes, this person was a civilian, then something changed and it somehow got even more complicated and the crime actually was committed. It's incredibly difficult when there are people on this platform who may not be full-on criminals in their own right, but they absolutely have connection to criminals. And that's why the FBI continued to surveil these people. That's why they thought they had every right to do so.
There's a lucky combination of circumstances that allows Anom to become so popular, right? Between the hacking and kind of disruption of the competitors and their own offering, which is, you know, significant. It has a lot of very shiny things that people want out of their phones. So what do you think actually allow them to be successful? Is it just because, actually law enforcement was not going after them. So they were not actually being hacked like the other companies. And so this created the perception of them being more secure. We know that trust becomes like a very important foundation in criminal enterprises in a way. Or was their service offering just massively different? Were they just so much better technically from the others?
I think it's both of those. And rather than just repeating that, all I would do is that you're absolutely right on both of those. And I would just add one more, which is I don't think I can overstate how important the support of Hakan Ayik was. This top tier, as I said, multi-billion-dollar drug trafficker. And he'd been on the run for years from the Australian authorities after smuggling methamphetamine, MDMA, heroin into Australia, everything you could possibly imagine. And like people knew this. People buying the phones and people reselling the phones knew, at least some of the ones I spoke to, they knew that Hakan was there. And it's almost like having a brand ambassador. The way law enforcement describe it is an influencer. And what is a better endorsement of your encrypted phone product than having one of the most wanted men in the world basically saying, I'm going to trust my freedom and my security into this product. And also, I'm probably going to sell it as well because like I'm going to make money off it as well. It's just like having a celebrity in the drug world promoting your product. So I think you're right on both of those. And it's just that he was really what catapulted Anom and gave it credibility in the criminal underground. Maybe Anom would have grown without him, but it absolutely would have taken much, much longer, like potentially many more years to get to the size that it ultimately did.
Well, as someone who's susceptible to Instagram ads, I can't blame them. Criminals, they're just like us,
Exactly.
Well, the book is at its core about Anom. It's about encryption. It's about how the operation was allowed to, flourish. Way. It's also about all these very serious crimes that happen and are enabled through technology. I'm wondering, for you as a tech journalist, was this kind of a different challenge, kind of reporting on organized crime, on murders, on assassinations, shootings, all of this drug trafficking that is happening? Was that something new to you? Was that something that, because you'd already been covering this, you were familiar with? How did you experience it?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, as I said, I came from covering the online drug markets. So I was already used to criminals using technology for sort of, I guess, traditional crimes. I put drug trafficking in there. It's more tech-enabled crime rather than tech-centric. So I was kind of used to it from that perspective. What changed for those online drug markets is that it wasn't just sort of ordinary people buying a party drug on the internet anymore. It developed into wholesale distributors of cocaine would actually source their drugs from Silk Road and from other drug markets. So I was getting used to the idea of organized crime or something like organized crime getting involved. So when I started covering the encrypted phone industry, I got death threats for printing the names of people who are involved with these companies. Like, do you realize who you're effing with when I publish their names? All of that sort of thing. So I was used to the violence there as well. And then I start obviously covering Anom and digging into the story. And it wasn't so much like a threat or anything like that. But what really genuinely blew me away was that it became clear that sort of cryptocurrency, and especially Bitcoin, was not auxiliary to these drug traffickers. It wasn't like, oh, that's a fun little gadget that means I can send some cash somewhere. It was absolutely core to their international operations. And I feel like we've spoken about that, or I hypothesized about it for a very long time now. Of course, law enforcement officials saying drug traffickers are going to use this, but it felt different when I read through hundreds of thousands of Anom messages spread across tens of thousands of pages of police reports that I got, and I see them just talking about cashing out Bitcoin in Colombia or doing it the other way around in Europe. And I found that staggering, to be honest, that this thing that used to be, a hobby for tech nerds, basically, is now a key linchpin for organized crime, for both drug trafficking and money laundering and all of that sort of thing. So that really blew me away about how technology is not, it's not a nice to have for these people, it is core to drug trafficking in the 21st century. Like, we're not talking about mobile phones and pages anymore. You need these phones and you need Bitcoin.
You mentioned The Wire before, and this may be just because I'm actually watching The Wire right now, but which was kind of lucky while I was reading this book, because I was just like, oh my God, yes, just like the show. But you know, there is a phrase in one of the first few episodes where they talk about whether you should be following the drugs or the money. And if you follow the drugs, you know, that takes you to the dealers. But if you follow the money, you don't really know where you're going to end up. And you talk about money launderers and the role they play and all the power they hold, you know, by not really doing, like, they're not getting their hands dirty, right? So did you find that, you know, that kind of phrase to be accurate here, where if you started following the money, it just opens the scope of this, you know, and it just blows it open?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, following the drugs, following the drug shipments, that's all well and good, but we've done that basically forever, right? It's when I was reading the messages of those money launderers, and there was one in particular called Abdullah Izzeldin, and he ends up being the underground banker for Microsoft, that very big drug trafficker I mentioned who tries to take control of Anom. And reading Izzeldin's messages was fascinating. It just revealed this entire underground system of banking, as I said, which allows these people to really, really quickly exchange wealth all around the world. And it's a little complicated, but like, I'll try to do it very, very briefly and simply. But let's say you have $50,000 in Europe and you want to move it to Colombia. You will text Izzeldin. He will send over a courier to your place in Europe. He'll take the 50K, put it in a safe house. He'll then update your quote unquote balance, which is a spreadsheet on his phone, and say, oh, you now have $50,000 in my bank, essentially, which then means, oh, hey, you want $50,000 in Colombia? I'll now go deliver that to wherever you want. It's basically like an ATM, but you're doing it across borders. And obviously, Izzeldin takes a cut depending on the country it's being done in, but it's only like 4, 5, 9%, depending on where it is. And as you say, not only is he's not getting his hands dirty because he's not touching drugs. He's like barely even touching the money. He's sending text messages, again, powered by these encrypted phones. I mean, if it wasn't on Anom, it was on some other provider, he may not have been caught, you know, and as well as the public corruption that was exposed by Anom, the money laundering was so interesting to me, because we talk about, again, I brought up Bitcoin and that's one thing, but then, you know, I don't know, suspicious transactions and banks and monitoring that. These people are not even in the banking system. You literally cannot monitor their transactions unless you have their encrypted text messages.
Early in the book, you tell us how it's actually law enforcement and the media's characterization of Phantom Secure, that kind of first encrypted phone company that we talked about. Like, they characterize it as this kind of uncrackable product. It's, you know, this next generation, it's making their lives so hard. And that's really what puts the company on the map for criminals. They're like, oh my God, if, you know, law enforcement is telling us that this it becomes the biggest hurdle for them, we should just get on it. So I'm intrigued how you feel as a journalist about this tension, right, between reporting and the way that media reporting sometimes ends up popularizing harmful content, something that can become ultimately harmful. You know, sometimes I'm personally torn, you know, as I was reading this, I kept thinking both, you know, you can look at the example of the coverage of disinformation, for example, where many times it's just because media tries to debunk something that it really becomes popular, and people are like, oh, well, if the media is trying to debunk it, it must be for, you know, some deep state thing. So it gains traction because of that. But then you also can look at the example of spyware, where it is because there was a lot of reporting about these shady companies that we've seen some sort of accountability and interest. So how do you feel about the encrypted phones in under this paradigm?
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the disinformation one, because I don't think this happens so much anymore, but when sort of disinformation on social media was really a big thing in 2015, 2016, up to 2018 probably, you would sometimes have journalists reporting on Twitter shuts down, massive disinfo operation. And you look at it and they've got like 10 likes or something. It's like you are amplifying this operation by covering it in this way, and you're actually giving it more credibility than it ever deserved to have. I'm not calling out anyone in particular. I just remember that being a big vibe back in 2016 and around that time.
Yeah, people gave Russia so much credit when they were actually like not that good on their Facebook pages. Right. Everyone was like, oh my God, they're infiltrating. And it was like, I don't know. There's like 10 people who liked it. That's, let's not do that.
Yeah, and like the threat was real, but the consequence can be very, very much debated, and it's going to be case by case for different for each different operation. I mean, before I answer your question, the one that often comes up for us at 404 Media is reporting on the abuse of AI. We do that a ton. Sam Cole, she was the first journalist to ever discover deepfakes way back when, I guess in 2017. And she was the first to reveal that and report on the harms. And now obviously we all know about them. And Emmanuel Mayberg, other co-founder, does a lot of it as well. And they have to report, especially now, on the use of these AI nudify apps in schools, where children or teenagers are using them on one another to sexually harass one another. And we're seeing finally some criminal prosecutions around that. But I bring that up because we actually very, very, very rarely name the app. We don't want to just point a kid to this app so then they can go use it. I guess you could argue, well, you have to inform parents so they can look for it. Maybe we would rather be cautious and just explain the phenomenon and explain this theme that's developing rather than giving people tools to go do that. Now, I actually think for encrypted phones, it's pretty different. I don't think that somebody's going to read my reporting, especially before the book when I was just covering the industry. I don't think they're going to read my stuff about Phantom Secure and go, wow, I'm going to get a Phantom Secure phone and become a drug trafficker. Like, maybe I'm wrong. You would be crazy to make that career change based on a blog post you read on Motherboard or something.
Damn it. Okay. So not that impact.
No. But there is a lot of stuff that I'm not going to include in the book. Like, I don't include the country where some of these certain meetings took place because that could harm informants. It could harm people who would be directly involved. I've changed actually quite a few names in the book, and I'm very clear. I think it's 4 or 5, something like that. And I always say I've changed the name, and the reason the vast majority of time is to protect somebody's safety. There is always a balance as a journalist, not just by what you decide to publish, but actually what you choose to omit. And I think some journalists would actually be quite annoyed that I'm saying that and would find that quite controversial. But like, when you've been covering organized crime as much as I have, you actually have to leave a lot of stuff out because otherwise people die. And I'm not exaggerating.
I'm going to turn from that very serious note to an actual silly question that I have. I always chuckle a little bit at the names that law enforcement gives their operations, and you have
so good.
You have some really good ones. I really like Small Ghost. Whoever came up with that is a genius. I love it. So my question is, did you get a sense of how these names come to be? Like, is this an organic, like, people start calling it, or do people sit down around a table and they're like, okay, what are the names? What do you think we should call it? Let's all vote. How does it happen?
A lot of the conversations in Anom, and I don't know if this specifically relates to the operation name, which is Operation Trojan Shield, and I'll explain that a bit more in a minute, but a lot of the key decisions in this entire operation happened over beers. They happened over beers between the AFP and the FBI and the San Diego prosecutors. And then later in Europe, like, again, I don't think this made it into the book as well, but, after the operation, after they announced it and closed Anom down, they went and they basically had a massive drunk session in some pub near The Hague. And of course, that's a celebration, but that was pretty constant throughout. And, people making these very, very important calls over beers. And that sounds frivolous and funny, but I actually also think it hits at something quite serious, which is like, this operation was so successful in part because there were really, really strong relationships here. This was not really agency to agency. It was a bunch of, by their own admission, cowboys from San Diego. They said that, not me. A bunch of cowboys from San Diego meeting up with their mates in Europe or the AFP and sorting out, how do we get around this incredibly difficult problem of encryption. As for the actual name of the operation, as I said, Trojan Shield, I don't know exactly how that came to be, but this is actually one of the ones I actually think is smarter than some of the other ones. Like, obviously, Trojan Horse, we all know that. Well, why don't we turn what is these criminals' sort of protection, their shield, around to bite them back, basically? I actually think that was one of the better ones. But yeah, it's not amazing, but, at least it's... At least it's not totally cringe.
It's not. It's quite good. Yeah, it makes sense that they all develop over the years, though.
Oh, yeah, yes. For sure. Yeah, and to the point where the last thing I'll say on that is, like, when you're making these really, really, really difficult decisions, I think it's very helpful that you know the person personally, because people's lives are at stake. Yeah. This is not sending nice little emails between agencies. This is like, we have to act now to potentially stop someone being killed. Do I trust this person?
Yeah. And trust is really a theme throughout your book. It's a need for trust within the company, within the agencies, even between criminals, right?
Yeah, totally. And it's that misplaced trust by the criminals that the FBI is able to leverage. And I think you actually touched on something really, really important, which is that it's not just the literal encryption technology inside these phones the criminals are looking for. They are looking for a brand, and they are looking for something to trust. And it's very funny because a lot of them would probably have been better off if they just bought an iPhone and they installed Signal. Like, security-wise, that would have been really good for a lot of them. But in their eyes, Apple is an American tech company, so they must work with the Americans, despite the whole San Bernardino 2016 case that maybe they missed the memo on. But in their eyes, well, Tim Cook or Mark Zuckerberg, whoever, is going to work with the cops, so we're not going to do that. So then they trust these other companies, and it turns out that that could be even more damaging to them. Like, their trust is entirely misplaced into the wrong industry.
Well, they should have been reading more blog posts, I think.
Yeah, exactly. They should be like reading like InfoSec Twitter and that sort of thing, and then they would have been fine.
So the part of the story that we still haven't covered is the very dramatic end. Right, this all comes to an end with the domino effect of operations follow the sun throughout one big day, culminating in this press conference. Right, what do you remember about that day? What did it feel like for you?
Yeah, no one's asked me that, and that's really, really funny. That's good. So I get an email on, I presume, June 6th. It must have been that, and it said, San Diego FBI to make announcement about the encrypted, hardened phone industry, which is what they call these phones. And I'm like, well, of course, that's very interesting. I had actually already years prior scooped the FBI on their shutdown of Phantom Secure. Like, I learned about that before they announced it, and I published a piece around about the same time. So I start to try to figure out, well, what the hell is going on. I'm not successful. I don't know what is going to be announced. So I just tune in. And I watched the press conference like everybody else on a live stream, which is being piped out from San Diego. Just before that, sort of rumblings get out onto Twitter, actually on InfoSec Twitter, funny enough, where people are talking about, hey, there's this phone called Anom, and I think it's backdoored. And that must be just because the Australians did their own press conference where they mentioned it, and then the Europeans. And it was just a matter of time difference that, I don't know, I hadn't seen the Australian press conference, I guess, and I was just tuned into the FBI's one. But people started to get very, very excited. The public did. And then people started to obviously freak out inside during those arrests because, as you say, follows the sun, starts in Australia, they do these big busts, then it moves to Europe. It gets to the point where at least one criminal in Europe learns about what is happening, drives from Sweden throughout Europe And those officials inside Europol have to basically shout at one another, like, he's in this country now, he's in this country, please execute the search warrant against him. And they're basically chasing him to hunt him down. And that could have also gone really, really poorly. As I understand it, that was a very, very violent person. They could have got away if the European officials weren't able to interface directly with one another to pounce on this guy.
One of the ultimate goals of the FBI in doing this entire thing, as you explain in the book, is actually, they know this is going to come out at some point, that they're going to have to come clean. But what they want to do with that announcement is actually destroy confidence in the encrypted phone ecosystem. So do you think they were successful in doing that? And of course, this doesn't mean that, they've gone back to, carrier pigeons or whatever. So what are the criminals doing now?
Yeah, and I mean, it goes back to that point of trust that you brought up, right? Not only does the FBI want to arrest a bunch of people or have its partners arrest a bunch of people, and it went into the hundreds and eventually more than 1,000 alleged criminals busted. They wanted to shatter trust in the encrypted hardened phone industry. And they could only do that if they came clean. They could only do that if they say, hey, look, we're the FBI. We were running Anom basically the entire time. Because then the criminals will go, well, damn, what if this next phone company is run by the Dutch? What if this next phone company is run by the FBI again? Like who knows? And the idea was that, yes, maybe they'll go back to face-to-face meetings or whatever, something that's maybe easier to surveil. Since then, I've spoken to drug traffickers and I've spoken to people who sell these phones, and they've absolutely been successful there. The FBI has seeded so much paranoia in this industry that one reseller in Europe I spoke to said it's basically impossible to build a customer base now because everybody is thinking like, well, what if the FBI is in that phone as well? That's not to say the encrypted phone industry is dead. Before the book came out, but after the Anom operation, I wrote a story about another encrypted phone company called Number One BC, Number One Business Communication. They present themselves as legitimate, they're super sketch, and they're being used by the Italian mafia. So these companies still exist, but they're far fewer and far between. And if they're not using those, some criminals have moved to, rather ironically, using Signal on a phone that they chuck out every couple of weeks or every month or whatever, which might actually be harder for the FBI to surveil. So maybe that backfired a little bit. But I do think that brings up a key question, which is, well, what happens when more of the criminals go to Signal? What happens when they go to the platforms that we all use as members of the public, as consumers, as policymakers, as journalists? Is the FBI prepared to infiltrate or otherwise compromise a platform like that? And to be absolutely clear, I'm not saying Signal is compromised. I have no evidence for that. I trust it every single day. I don't think that means the FBI is just going to say, okay, job well done, let's all go home. It's what happens now which has people potentially concerned.
Okay, that's kind of unfair because that's exactly the question that I had for you. It's like, okay, what happens now if everyone's on Signal? And what are the the privacy and surveillance concerns that raises? Because I think, as you point out, that, the public in general might understand, okay, you have this company, of course it was catering just to criminals. It didn't really affect, civilians. You were not going to get swept up into this if you just went about your normal life, as we discussed before. But now it just seems if law enforcement is getting creative in the way in which they're approaching it. Kind of mainstream products are just going to be, and we know that law enforcement has a particular relationship with encrypted companies and their demands for backdoors or access, or for them to be able to see these things in order to stop crimes. So, do you have an answer, or are we just going to leave this as, well, these are the things that we're going to look forward to?
Yeah. I mean, I think more than anything, Anom showed the extreme measures that law enforcement is prepared to go to. Whether you agree with the operation or you have concerns, I think everybody would agree it was an extreme measure. They ran a tech company for organized crime. Come on, they've never done that before. It was really, really wild. So it shows that they're going to do that. And yes, I see several options in front of us. The first is that companies like Signal or any tech companies could provide data to law enforcement under legal powers. I don't know, TikTok does this all the time. Facebook does it all the time. Twitter, Discord. You have companies like Telegram who absolutely do not, or they do it in a very minimal way. And then you have companies like Signal who will comply, but they are technologically built to only provide tiny, basically useless data. And generally, I think that's a good thing. We don't want the security of our encrypted messages undermined. When you introduce a tool like that, it could be abused in other ways. We saw Apple try to do this where they were planning to introduce scanning for CSAM on material that's uploaded to iCloud. They threw that out because they realized they could not build it securely. So basically, that's the first option, which is the front door, I guess I would say. The other is that you have law enforcement do these crazy operations, and maybe you think that's good. I think the FBI would like it a more sustainable solution, and even European officials I spoke to, they said, look, these operations are great, but we think we should have them all the time. So they kind of want the first one. And I don't know the answer to whether we actually want law enforcement to do these crazy operations. I just know that now the book is out, we can finally diagnose like what actually happened, and then we can have a discussion about it. And the third option is targeted hacking, and that's personally where I lean more towards. Rather than undermining the security of a tech product, rather than the FBI running its own tech startup for criminals, maybe you invest more into targeted hacking of specific users under appropriate legal regimes. And the FBI does this. Law enforcement agencies around the world do this as well. Some people do it, I would say, poorly, not in an operational sense, but, people using NSO Group to target journalists or dissidents. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the FBI or another agency saying, we have a drug trafficker, they're using an encrypted messaging app, let's send a specific exploit to that specific phone, and then we get just their messages. That seems more legally appropriate, more proportionate, rather than running an entire tech company. And then there are all these other discussions about, well, the exploits are very expensive and Apple fixes them, the FBI has to buy more exploits. I don't know, find more money. I know that's very simplistic. Yeah. But that's just the cat and mouse game, I'm afraid, of surveillance. Like, you have to invest in surveillance capabilities, they get fixed, you continue. So I know that was a very long answer, but actually, through writing this book, I've now found I lean personally more towards legal targeted hacking.
Yeah. Now, I understand from your acknowledgement section in the book that Netflix bought the rights to the book. So can we expect this to be turned into a new show that we can binge? Or is it going to be more of a documentary? How involved are you going to be in this?
Yeah. So Netflix has acquired the rights. They acquired it actually before the book came out. It was based on the proposal, which I think is just because it's such a wild story. And it was very clear that, I had the sources to do it. Mm-hmm. It's a feature film, scripted, so non-documentary, in active development, and I think that's probably all I should say on it. All I would say is that I'm very excited to see what they do with it, because I think it's a very entertaining story, and I also think it's a very important story that maybe more people can learn about, even through a scripted medium.
Absolutely. Well, I'm looking forward to it. So, before we wrap up, as is tradition on Chatter, we are going to end with our final Chatterbox question. So could you recommend a recent book you've read, podcast you've listened, or a TV show that you've watched, that is not work related, it's not, serious? How are you decompressing when you're not writing an incredible book and also doing all the great work that you do at 404 Media?
It's funny you bring up The Wire, because usually I just watch The Sopranos or The Wire again, but that is work related because it just makes me think about work the entire time. So what I will say is that the new season of The Bear is out soon, which is an incredible show. I mean, when I say it out loud, I'm underselling it. It's a show about a kitchen. No, it's about these people who come together from very different forms of life, and they come and they build this amazing restaurant together, and there's so much drama, there's so much tension. It has one of the best episodes of television I've ever seen. I think it's an entire single shot in season 2, and it's beautiful to watch. It's exhilarating, and I'm absolutely going to watch season 3, which, I don't know, maybe that's out today. I'm not sure. I need to catch up on it because I've been so engrossed in work, but that is 100% my non-work recommendation.
That's a solid one. Yes.
For sure.
Do you see any parallels between, the kitchen and building up your own company?
Oh yeah. The yelling at each other when yes. I mean, look, I'm not going to lie. Stuff gets stressful. Obviously, we don't lie at each other, but yell at each other. Sorry. Obviously, we don't do that. But when we were leaving Vice and then launching this company, none of us have done this before. And I said that the technological infrastructure is there. We use a CMS called Ghost, and it accepts subscriptions. You set up a Stripe account, you do all that. That's all fine. But nothing can prepare you for flicking the switch on your own company. And we got some coverage in the New York Times that was great. And that day when you go loud, nothing can really prepare you for that. And it's a mix of exhilaration and stress. And yeah, I absolutely think there is a parallel there. And you all come together to try to make something that's bigger and better than yourself.
Well, Joseph, thank you so much for coming on. This was fantastic. Everything I hoped for.
Thank you so much. I really, really genuinely enjoyed this conversation.
That was Chatter, a production of Lawfare and Goat Rodeo. Please subscribe to the podcast and find us on Twitter @ThatWasChatter.